Welcome, listeners. You are listening to a podcast from the Free People's Movement out of Sweden. Episode 10. The Hidden Enemy Listens to Everyone. During the 1930s and early 1940s, Rudolf Hess was the Führer's deputy. On May 10, 1941, 6 weeks before Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union, Hess flew to Scotland in an attempt to make peace with Britain. He was arrested and taken prisoner of war. Operation Barbarossa was the code name for Nazi Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union. This event began on June 22, 1941. Over 4.5 million soldiers from the Axis powers invaded the Soviet Union along a 2,900 kilometers long front. During World War II, both Denmark and Norway were occupied by Germany on April 9, 1940. In order for Germany to be able to communicate with its occupation troops in Norway, it was necessary to rent Swedish telephone lines. The demand was granted, with the hope of being able to use this to eavesdrop on the German messages. The crypto department was set to intercept German communications. But when they started with this, it turned out that the Germans were communicating with a code that initially seemed impossible to crack. This was the merit of the German G-machine. Mathematics professor Arne Berling, at the Swedish Armed Forces Crypt Detail, was commissioned to tackle the G-machine cipher. In a few weeks, Berling managed to crack the German G-machine, already in the summer of 1940, only using pen and paper, alone, and with only 1 or 2 days of collected messages. Through Berling's efforts, it was possible to manufacture their own crypto machines, and thus the Swedish intelligence service was able to decode almost 300,000 German messages over the next few years. The G-machines were manufactured by Siemens, in Germany, and it's a pretty safe bet that these machines were already compromised, right from the start. Berling's role as the illusionist cryptographer was only just that. An illusion. In 1941, Swedish authorities became the first outside Germany to know that an attack on the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa, was imminent. This information was relayed to Stalin from the Soviet ambassador in Stockholm, Alexandra Kollontaj. In June 1942, the Germans found out that Sweden could read their messages sent with the G-machine. Shortly afterwards, the German signals became completely incomprehensible as the Germans had switched to other cryptographer machines. At that point, Stalin had realized that Sweden had been able to listen to the German communications, at least as early as 1940. And after the Winter War with Finland, he probably figured out that they were listening to Soviet communications, as well. In 1942, Stalin knew. The Cold War was already approaching. The Continuation War, also known as the Second Soviet-Finnish War, was a conflict fought by Finland together with Nazi Germany against the Soviet Union. This conflict was part of World War II and lasted from 1941 to 1944. On the 22nd of June 1941, Germany launched an invasion of the Soviet Union. 3 days later, the Soviet Union conducted an air raid on Finnish cities. This prompted Finland to declare war and allow German troops stationed in Finland to begin offensive warfare. In connection with the end of the Continuation War, there was an operation called Stella Polaris. This was a secret Finnish intelligence operation with the aim of moving equipment and sensitive intelligence material from Finland to Sweden. That way, operations could continue in Sweden, and the material would not fall into Soviet hands, which was of great importance to Sweden. Remember from our last episode how Sweden supplied Finland with Soviet intelligence during the Winter War. Immediately before World War II, the Nordic countries stated their neutrality, but Sweden changed its position to that of non-belligerent at the start of the Winter War. Operation Stella Polaris was planned for the summer of 1944, when it seemed clear that Finland would lose the war, and it was estimated that the Soviet Union would be able to occupy Finland. The operation was based in the small fishing village of Nampnäs, in Narpes, Ostrobothnia, from where the archive was shipped to Swedish ports. One of the intentions from the Finnish side was to be able to establish Finnish military signal reconnaissance on Swedish soil for a possible Finnish government in exile. The intentions from the Swedish side, if they aren't obvious enough, was to not get caught violating the rules of war, supplying Finland with Soviet intelligence and weapons during armed conflict. On September 22, 1944, a very large part of the Finnish signal reconnaissance was transferred to Sweden. Operation Stella Polaris became important for the construction of the Swedish Armed Forces Radio Agency, the FRA. From the Swedish side, Major Carl Peterson, head of the Sea Bureau, was responsible for the operation. Approximately 800 people were transported through Finland, on 3 ships across the Gulf of Bothnia, between Narpes and Härnösand, and 1 ship between Nystad and Garvel. The ships were also loaded with packing boxes with archives and signal reconnaissance equipment. As the Soviet Union did not annex Finland, after the Moscow Peace Treaty on September 19, 1944, the majority of Finnish staff with families returned home around the turn of the year 1944 to 1945, except those employed by the Swedish Armed Forces Radio Agency. They had to cross the border at Torn River on their own, in secret. Sweden was offered to take over equipment and certain documents. The Swedish Armed Forces Radio Agency thus gained access to technical equipment and 7 filing cabinets, which became an important basis for their newly started operations. Operation Stella Polaris gave Sweden access to large amounts of sensitive materials, as well as knowledge from signaling technicians. For Finland, the affair entailed domestic political complications because of the Communist Party's strong influence in the government. From October 1944, the intelligence material was sorted in the basement of Hotel Aston, in Stockholm. Operations manager Reino Halamar had then microfilmed the material and sold it to intelligence agencies in several countries. It was then shipped from Hotel Aston by the Swedish Armed Forces Radio Agency. Large parts of the material got stored by Carl Bond at Horningsholm Castle, and 29 boxes by Svante Paulsson at Rottneros from the 20th of March 1945. 7 boxes with sensitive material had previously been handed over to the radio agency. The Finns involved in Operation Stella Polaris were persecuted and arrested after the return of the communist-dominated Finnish state police, the security police, the so-called Red Stapo. It was not until the early 1950s that the Chancellor of Finland declared that those who took part in Operation Stella Polaris were not in a position to be charged with war crimes. In Nampnäs, there is a memorial to the operation. 15 to 20 Finnish signal scouts, who came to Sweden in Operation Stella Polaris, immediately became Swedish citizens and remained as employees of the radio agency in Sweden. The Finnish intelligence chief Alla de Parsinen, who along with Reino Halamar, had the highest responsibility for the operation, lived in the United States until the 1970s. Reino Halamar moved to Spain, where he assumed the name Ricardo Palma, and started a construction company with his son. Later, in December 1960, the original material that was left in Sweden was burned at Lövsta garbage station in Stockholm. Whatever the radio agency still had was also burned. This was staged after an irregular intervention by the retired Swedish general and former head of the army, Carl August Ehrensvärd. At the time of Operation Stella Polaris, he was the chief of Swedish defense. Let's just say that the Swedes wanted to make sure that the information stayed secret. Operation Stella Polaris has been documented in books, radio documentaries, and TV movies since the 1990s, but many questions remain. One such question is whether the Soviets would look kindly upon the evidence inside the archives of Stella Polaris as it pertained to Sweden's role in the Winter War. Sweden was, after all, a neutral or non-belligerent country. On paper, the fact that Finland has been under the thumb of the Swedish deep state since pretty much forever can't stay hidden much longer. At the same time, the insights that the deep state was behind the creation of communism have increased dramatically. Let's just say that the Finnish people are in for some surprising revelations in the not-too-distant future. I wonder what happened to the microfilms. Whoever Halimar had sold it to, maybe they still have it. And who's to say that Halimar didn't keep his own copies? It would be a terrible shame if this information were to surface. Especially now, when things are going so terribly well for the deep state and the Wallenberg family. Follow us into the next episode, where we take a look at a certain general who is more important than most people realize. Thank you for listening.